Belated Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Um, we are going to do the Parashah for this week. It is Parashah 17, Yitro, which in English is Jethro. Um, and so, as you can see, we pick up with Moshe's interaction with Yitro, and then we go into some other things before the Parashah is done. I actually have it published on somewhat on time this week, so you guys can enjoy it a little bit earlier and uh, read along with me and say it along with me for this parashah. So, having said that, let's go ahead and get started. Um, all right, so um, we are picking up at Shemot or Exodus chapter 18, starting at verse 1. So we see where Yitro is coming to, or Jethro is coming to meet Moshe and by proxy all of Israel out in the wilderness. Um, and so they're getting really close to Mount Horeb, or also it's called Sinai. Uh, and so he's out there to meet them. Now, remember that Yitro lived very close to Mount Horeb, and as evidence, with Moshe's time with Yitro and tending his flocks. If you remember back with the burning bush incident, Moshe was tending Yitro's flocks as when he saw that on Mount Horeb itself. So again, you can see how relatively close Yitro lived to the mountain. And so now we find him coming out to visit. Um, and so they meet with each other. And um, they also, and I didn't mention this, but they also, in the beginning there, talk about how Moshe had, at one point, it doesn't say it in Shemot what happened, but at some point, Moshe had sent his family back to Yitro. Now, remember, when Moshe went to Egypt, he took um, his wife and his kids with him there. But at some point, I guess maybe Moshe sensing the danger faced with Pharaoh, and also maybe some other things he considered, he went ahead and decided to send um, his wife and his kids back to Pharaoh, or sorry, to Yitro. And so now Yitro's coming, and he's bringing with him Moshe's wife and kids. So that's where we're at now. Um, so they meet. Moshe bows before his father-in-law in reverence. This is a very common thing back in those days. It's still a common thing over in the Middle East. Um, and they fall into his face. They kiss each other, and not like we're used to nowadays, but like kiss on the cheek and like just a really warm greeting. Moshe had a really good relationship, it seems, with Yitro. Yitro took him in, treated him very well, acting in righteousness towards Moshe. And so they still had that kind of a rapport with each other. And Moshe really saw him as a father figure. You'll see later on when he actually takes Yitro's advice, it's like taking advice from a father. So that relationship was still really good, even after all that time. Um, all right. Just like they go into catching up with each other, just like you would expect. And Moshe tells his father all the wonderful things that God did for Israel, and Yitro is overjoyed. He is so happy for what God had done for both Moshe and for Israel. And that's not something you hear very much nowadays. Usually, people are not, they're not really happy when they hear about God doing anything for Israel. Um, but um, but this particular Gentile, this is a Gentile here, was not a Jew. It's not a Jew. This particular Gentile was overjoyed by what God was doing for Israel, and in the process, he resolved. Now remember, it talks about that Yitro was a priest of Midian. Okay, now um, you know that this could it wasn't just he followed one God. It says here he actually probably followed more than one God. It's probably multiple gods that he followed. However, at this point, he resolves and knows at this point that God is greater than all other gods. After hearing all that God did, after seeing, and not only that, it's also interesting also that Yitro recognizes God's greatness, but also his righteousness in punishing Egypt for their arrogance. So Yitro makes some really astounding statements here where he understands now that God is greater than all the gods, um, and that God is righteous, was righteous in his punishing of Egypt. Now, a lot of people say, well, you know, that's just mean for God to punish people. But, you know, like any kind of father, like any other king, if you want to, you know, in those all kind of different ways he has a relationship with us, he punishes us as a king. He punishes as a father chastising his children. This is why God does what he does. Okay. And as you notice in the top in the third bullet there, it's important. It is when a Gentile, who an unbelieving Gentile, comes around, either a Messianic Jew, a Gentile Christian, or even a mainstream Jewish person, um, they should walk away um, with that kind of resolve after an encounter with us. When an unbeliever encounters us, they should walk away, even if it's subconsciously, they walk away with either a full resolve or more of a resolve that God is greater than all their gods and that God is righteous and God is great. Those are the things that Gentiles should walk away with after encountering a believer. I'm not saying they're going to like all of a sudden, you know, turn and believe, but it should hit them somehow. Hopefully they will be like Yitro and say and just espouse his beliefs and throw themselves over to the Lord. But it may not always happen that way. But at least they should walk away impacted positively for God. Okay, so when they're there, Yitro, after acknowledging this is more kind of follows along with that. He offers a burnt sacrifice. Now, whenever you see a burnt sacrifice, that was usually offered for sin. So, right, even though, and this is probably not just a Israel thing. It was probably practiced by uh, other religions, other cults, and things in that region as well. That a burnt sacrifice was done for sin. So Yitro offered a burnt sacrifice for sin, and he offered other sacrifices too. And I probably what one of them was a fellowship offering. Okay, and so after the sin offering, they offer the fellowship offering. And if you read later on the Torah, that fellowship offering after it was offered was supposed to be eaten together with the people and also with God. It was a fellowship offering. It was there for them to eat, to actually sit at a table together and eat together and fellowship together. That was the purpose of it. And um, so that offering is offered, uh, and then they sit down and they eat together. And I honestly, I put it here in the second bullet. It is a beautiful picture. It is a beautiful picture of them fellowshipping with God. Now, obviously, God wasn't sitting there eating the meal with them, but He was there. He was fellowshipping with right along with them, sitting together, God and His creation. Um, so they were fellowshipping with God. They were fellowshipping with each other, and you know, whenever we do fellowship, we also need to fellowship with others. Okay? So, for example, even though Yitro was Moshe's father-in-law, he was also a Gentile. He was not of a descendant of Abraham. Okay? And so, with that, he was an other. He wasn't. So, what God is saying here through this is that when we fellowship, as long as they're, I mean, obviously with others, I mean, they have to, you know, if they're not going to follow God, if they're antagonistic and all these other things, then obviously you don't fellowship with them. But at this point, Yitro became a follower of the one true God, even though he was a Gentile. And so, even though he was a Gentile, he should be welcomed in with open arms and to fellowship with those who are believers together with God. And that's the way it should be. And that is the beautiful picture we are painted with here, with God and these people, Jew and Gentile, all fellowshipping together around the table. And so, and I can tell you, this probably greatly pleased God. Um, it was something beautiful, it was something wonderful, and it was something that which God probably cherished, because this is what God wants. He wants all of His people, all depending on where you come from, what tribe, background, wherever you have, Jew, Gentile, no matter what it is, all coming together as one, but then also to be one with Him and to fellowship with Him eternally. This is what God's always wanted. This has been the plan from the beginning. And so we broke that when mankind fell. This is a kind of a picture, a foreshadowing of the restoration of that fellowship with God and with our fellow man, which is what God has wanted all the time. It's been all along. And so I can tell you that God cherished this. Okay, so then we get on and start moving on, and we start getting into Moshe's day-to-day things he does. So, um, and if you look, you know, through Shemot, and then look further into Torah, you're going to see that Moshe was kind of a jack of all trades. I mean, he basically did a little bit of everything um, in Israel. In addition to his judging and helping decide cases, he's the one that actually first set up the tabernacle and then tore it down, or like not just tore it down, but he disassembled it. He's in like a little bit of everything, and so uh, and obviously he's come at this point. He is a type of priest to Israel. He is a go-between. He is the one who presents um, the people's request to God, and he goes ahead and actually tells the people God's commands for them. This is even before the Levites were even put into office, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later. But right now, there's no Levitical office of priesthood right now. It does not exist right now. So right now, not only is Moshe acting in that way, but you're going to see later. We're going to kind of discuss um, what priests the scripture is referring to before the Levites have actually been put into that office. Okay, so Yitro watches this, and we don't know how long he kind of watched this, but he sees this. He must have seen a long line of people waiting to have their cases decided, and seen how long it was, and just seeing the gravity and enormity of it all. He sits there and is flabbergasted. He's like, "What are you doing? Why are you sitting here by yourself, doing this all by yourself?" And so Moshe tries to explain, hey, God gives me the commands, and I go ahead and relate them to people, and I help them decide their cases by interpreting what God said. And Yitro says, what you're doing is no good. Um, and there's probably all kind of reasons for that. You're going to burn yourself out. You can't possibly handle this load. Um, all the different things. So as a leader, as a father, he suggests to Moshe that he goes ahead and finds men that are capable to go ahead and I said rule there, but to go ahead and basically um, be a manager or a leader over people groups of various sizes, tens, hundreds, fifties, thousands, whatever it happens to be. And he qualifies they must be men who fear God, they must be men who value truth, and they must be men who hate bribery. And those are all important things for people to judge cases accurately. And so Yitro tells them they should handle all the cases except for the hard ones, which will go to you. Now, in verse 23, Yitro says his suggestion, from what I read in the Hebrew, his suggestion was conditional on God's approval. Okay, he didn't just say do it. He said if God approves, do it. But when we read later on, or in the next verse or so, you don't see where God explicitly approved that plan. Okay, so did he approve? Well, so Moshe did end up listening to his father-in-law. Again, we don't see whether God explicitly approved, but what I do see later on is that Moshe tells God again later on that he can't handle all the people on his own. That he can't handle it. And so God tells him to do something very similar to what Yitro said. And so I guess if you kind of look at it that way, maybe God did give permission, and it just doesn't mention it in the word. So after all this, and God and Moshe following and Yitro, I guess you could say being used by God to help Moshe out, departs, and we don't hear about him again. At least from what I've read, I may have missed it. You don't read about Yitro anymore. And so now we move on to chapter 19. We're actually at the theophany at Sinai, which means God's appearance, God's revelation of Himself to the people. So Israel is now in the waters of Sinai, so they're right there below the mountain. They're right at the mountain. So they're spread out right before the mountain. Okay. And so this chapter begins a series of treks up and down the mountain. Some of the treks up and down are implied, other ones are explicitly said. And some of them don't require a fast, and other ones require him to fast for 40 days and 40 nights. And now in Deuteronomy or in Devarim, it recounts a lot of this and it kind of adds details. I will go ahead when we actually get to Devarim. I will go ahead and we will expound on some of that. But right now I'm going to stick to what the text says in this particular book, just so we don't put the cart before the horse, so to speak. We will get to more details. I'm sure many of you know that are spoken of later in Devarim. But right now we're going to go ahead and stick with what is written here in Shemot. Okay. So when Moshe talks to God and is called by God up to the mountain, God's first words to him are to point out what he did for Israel and to offer Israel to be his own treasure out of all the people on the earth, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, here's the conditional, if they listen to his voice. Okay? So, God tells Moshe to tell Israel all these words. He goes down and relays them to the people, and the people agree to do them. Now, God hasn't even told them yet what he wants them to do. He just says, you listen to me, you'll be my kingdom of priests and holy nation, a treasure out of all the people on the earth. Okay? He hasn't even told them what he wanted to do yet, but they agreed, which that's great that they are so eager. And I wish that enthusiasm would have stayed with them throughout the trek in the wilderness and towards the promised land when they sent the spies and all. I wish they would have maintained through all of that, where you wouldn't have had the 40 years of wandering that had to happen. But unfortunately, this eagerness they show isn't long lived. All right, so God tells Moshe that he is about to come to him in a thick cloud with the purpose, and God says this explicitly, with the purpose that all the people will hear God speak with him and believe him forever. Now, this has been fulfilled in a way to where the Jewish people still listen to Moshe and follow his every word to this day. However, over the millennia, especially during the time in the wilderness, the people did not listen to Moshe consistently and often failed miserably. So even though it has been fulfilled, whereas the Jewish people are still and very much listen to Moshe, as should the Gentile believers as well. It has not been perfect where you have some of the people who listen, other ones that don't. You had the same thing back in the wilderness, only in that mode most of the people that generation did not, and that's why their children were the only ones who were allowed to go into the promised land, which is kind of a warning for us today, right? The people are to prepare as God is perfectly holy. Okay, so there's a preparation that they needed to go through to make sure they were ready to encounter him. So even stand at the periphery of the mountain, not even going up it. We're just talking about saying around the periphery of the mountain. Even then, they had to have basically clean themselves, clean their clothing, refrain from sexual relations with their wives. and vice versa with the husbands. Um, and they had to literally be ritually ready to even be that close to God. Okay. Now you're going to see in the remainder of this chapter that it very explicitly talks about that God does not take kindly to violations of his holiness. Okay? God is holy, and his holiness is not to be impugned upon at all. And so usually, almost always, when that happens in the Torah, that person is put to death. Um, that God does not take it kindly. And so God's, as the good God He is, and knowing how how His holiness is guarded so much, warns the people. He doesn't want them to die. He doesn't want them to do something like that and end up dead. That's not His wish. And a matter of fact, it's never God's wish for somebody to die. He hates death. Even though He uses death right now because of what happened with our fall and our disobedience, He hates death. And Ezekiel talks about that. That is not His wish for anyone to die in their sins. It's not wish for anyone to die. Period. Death was never a part of the plan. We did that to ourselves. We separated ourselves from Him. We declared independence from Him by our sinfulness, and that's why we have this issue. So God tells Moshe they are not to come up to the mountain. And what they mean that up to means like go up to like near the mountain until the shofar sounds. And this is not just an ordinary shofar. This is not Moshe or Aaron standing up there, or anybody else blowing a shofar. This is a heavenly shofar. This is the shofar from heaven that's being blown. Now, Moshe comes back down from the mountain again. This is kind of one of those ways where it's insinuated that Moshe had gone back up and gives the people God's commands. So after 3 days of consecration and preparation, God descends on the mountain in fire. Now, there's 3 days, for us believers in Yeshua, it kind of points to the 3 days that Yeshua was in the heart of the earth, um, you know, uh, letting the captives free of those who believed and preaching to the rest of them who have never heard of the gospel, and bringing them, those who believed, to paradise and out of Sheol. And so, it's kind of the same thing here, where you go through that kind of a consecration and preparation period before, they come to the fullness. I guess you kind of look at the same way where we're being consecrated and prepared as believers before Yeshua returns um, in the relatively near future. So God descends on the mountain in fire, preceded by thunderings, lightnings, and a thick cloud. Now, if you think ahead to the story of to Eliyahu or Elijah, where he was in a cave and God came to him and he was preceded by all this. It's said in there that God wasn't in the fire or the thunder or the earthquakes, but that it was a still small voice that appeared or that happened or spoke to Eliyahu. In this instance, you have the same kind of things that are happening, but there's a very loud voice, and also in addition, you have a very loud heavenly shofar. So there's this loud shofar, and if you see in the next bullet, that shofar, the closer God gets, the louder and louder that shofar gets. It's kind of like, when a king is announced in earthly kingdoms, when they're blowing that trumpet and announcing the king. Well, this shofar is blown, and it just keeps sounding, and it keeps sounding, and it gets louder, and it gets louder and louder. And then eventually God answers a thundering voice. You can just imagine the overwhelming experience that Israel is having. And the whole point of this, we go back, the whole point is for the people to believe in God and to never not doubt Moshe anymore, about what God does through him. And so, uh, Moshe again, the shofar gets louder and louder until Moshe finally speaks with God, and then God answers a thunderous voice. Again, he could have answered with a small still voice like he did Eliyahu, but the purpose here is to, for lack of a better word, the shock effect. You're shocking the people. You're getting them to. It's like a shake, a wake up, a way for them to realize and to know um, that God, if they didn't already know, God is real. God is in control. God is with Moshe, and they should listen to Moshe and listen, and by proxy listen to God and respect Him, because that should have put a little bit of fear in them. That they already saw it in Egypt, right? Um, or at least heard about it if it was in outside of Goshen, the things were happening. And so they should already know, but now this is being reinforced. Okay, so God called them to the top of the mountain again. After arriving, He tells them to warn the people, not even the priests, to break through. Okay, because you may have people, despite all that's happening, are curious and want to see what's going on. God's like, no, 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 they are not to come up the mountain. They're not. They're to stay where they're at. And a matter of fact, uh, Moshe will go ahead and set up a boundary around the mountain to consecrate it in effect and keep it separate from the people to where the people don't come up there. And that's what God told him to do, and to also return with Aharon. So he went back down again and did that and returned back up the mountain with Aharon. Okay. So the result is achieved. Read that earlier in the chapter where it says that people trembled at God's arrival. And then now they're telling him, hey, we don't even want to hear God speak anymore. You talk to him. We don't want to hear him. Now, again, this whole episode here is also um, re-narrated in Devarim. Again, I know there are bits here that are not are meant. There are bits in Devarim that are not mentioned here, but I'm going to stick with the text we have here, and I'm not going to conflate it with Devarim because I don't want to cause confusion. So let's just stick with the scripture we have right now. All right, now, so it says not even the priests are allowed to come up on the mountain. Okay, so who are the priests? They weren't the Levites. We didn't have the incident with the golden calf, which we'll see here in another parashah or two. So who are these priests? Okay, well, we have to think back to the culture of the time. So at the culture of the time, usually the father or the firstborn were the priests of their household. And so if you're talking about the priests here, you're talking about the priests of every family that were there to actually serve um, serve God on behalf of the family, and to if they do, receive God's commands and pass them on. And so there were priests there. They were not Levitical priests. They were just your fathers and your firstborns. Okay, now remember also the firstborns were the firstborns were his. Remember back in the last parashah, God said all the firstborn of everything, both animals and people, of both all the male firstborns were his. They were the ones that are supposed to go ahead and actually be made priests because they were God's. Okay, if you remember, if we look back to Shmuel or Samuel, Hannah brought him to Eli, um, to to become dedicated to the service of God. So in effect, he became a sort of priest. And so in this way, the firstborn that are dedicated to God here, they become a de facto priests. Okay, so just kind of let you see what's going on here. So the firstborn right now, the ones that are actually becoming the priests. Okay, later on when the Levites take over, that's changed. So right now these firstborn are the priests. Okay, so now I move on to chapter 20. So in chapter 20, we actually have what's called, the 10 words, what's also known as the 10 commandments are given. Okay, so this is the core of what all the rest of the Torah is built on. And actually, if you go on later in the Tanakh, you see where they've whittled it down to just loving God and loving your fellow man. Maybe it's even more simplify it. But the covenant with them, this is the 10 words of that covenant. It is the core, it is the foundation of that covenant. There are other things that God does and speaks and commands, but this is the core of the covenant. And God lays out the foundation of this covenant with the exact same thing that He's told Moshe a few times. God's redemption of Israel from Egypt. That is the foundation. Okay, He redeemed us. He redeemed Israel from Egypt, and so Israel is now His. When you redeem something, usually you pay money for it, and once you pay money for it, you own it. You're redeeming it, and so God owns Israel at this point. And so with that, God has the authority to make demands and commands on the people of Israel. And so now I add this one add on here in the 10 words because if you remember in the Parashah or the New Testament, Yeshua says that my burden is easy, or my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Okay, Pharaoh, his yoke and burden were not. They were his yoke was harsh and his burden was heavy. And so God replaces the burden and the yoke of Egypt with his yoke and burden was his light and easy and righteous. And so God is giving them a better set of commands, a better life, a better goal than Egypt ever could have. So now, as we read the 10 words, we're actually going to go through them verbatim. They are not to just be taken by the literal meaning of the text. So when you read the text and it says explicitly, "Do not do this." You also need to see past that, which is something Yeshua does in the Parashah. So it should be expanded out that as much as possible the meaning as it can. For example, so God says not to murder, okay? But if you deprive someone of their living, is that not a type of murder? That's what I'm talking about. So when you're reading through the 10 words or 10 commandments, don't just stop at face value. Also think them through. Well, what could qualify? For example, in the example I gave you, what could qualify as murder? Well, if I deprive somebody of living, that could qualify as murder, not just the physical stabbing or shooting or whatever of that person. Okay, so let's go through all 10. So the first one, and these are divided up between commands of us towards God and commands of us towards our neighbors. So we go through the first 4 that are towards God, and the last 6 are towards our neighbor. So you shall have no other gods before me. Okay, you are mine. Other gods are false and fake, anyways. But you are mine. Don't have any other gods before me. Do not make for yourself a graven image. Why? Because God is not anything of this earth or this universe. He exists outside of this universe. Okay, so we shouldn't be making, you're not supposed to make an image of him, and you're not supposed to make an image of any other idol either. Not that is in heaven above, or the earth below, or in the water on the earth. Nothing. No images. Nothing to worship. Okay, there's only one God. You're not to bow down to them. So if you do see any of them around and you haven't been destroyed yet, you're not to bow down to them, and you're not let anyone make you serve them. Okay. Matter of fact, when God sends them into the land, they're supposed to destroy all that. And the reason is, for I, Adonai, your God, am a jealous God. So I want you to also take into effect and look at this as a marriage covenant. Okay? God is not going to be happy if you're committing spiritual adultery with another God. Okay? He is our God. He's a jealous God. And he is righteous in that he brings the iniquity of the fathers upon their children to the third and fourth generations. Well, how that happened? Why should the children be punished and blamed for something somebody else did? Well, that's not what this means here. What it means is that your iniquity, God will allow to flow down to your children. And the whole purpose is not to destroy the children, but to get the children to realize your wickedness and what you brought on them, and for them to return to God themselves. Okay? So they will realize our Father, by doing this, brought this on us, and we need to return to the Lord. But also showing loving kindness to the 1,000 generations of those who love me. So if those children turn to the Lord, that curse becomes a blessing, because in his loving kindness, he shows grace and mercy to thousands of generations of those who love him. So they turn and love, and they keep his mitzvot after their father did not. That is turned into a blessing. Okay, so again, don't see that third and fourth generation thing as God unjustly punishing the children. He's not. What's happening is that the outflow of their father's sin is entering into their life. Okay? But to counter that, all they have to do is turn to God, and he will go ahead and cancel that out, and show them, bless them, and show them grace and mercy, which is what he wants to, by the ways. He'd rather show grace and mercy than show judgment. You're not to take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for Adonai will not hold him guiltless that takes his name in vain. God's name is one with himself. And so just like you don't violate his holiness, you don't violate his name, for it is perfectly holy like he is. And so we don't use his name. We don't just throw his name around casually, and taking oaths with it, or just using it as an exclamation or anything of that nature. We're not supposed to use it that way at all. His name is holy. We use it properly when we address him, when we talk to him, when we talk about him to others. We use it properly and with the highest, the utmost of respect. And notice that name Adonai is a placeholder for God's true name, which is the tetragrammaton, which is the 4 letters Yod He Vav He in Hebrew. And so that name, the name that God said he would be eternally known by, is not to be taken in vain. Now, we don't really know. I mean, most scholars say it is Yahweh. However, we do not know that 100%, and therefore, and then with Jewish people, you don't even use that unless you are praying or doing something like preaching, something of that nature. And then when you're not doing that, you don't even say Adonai, you say Hashem. And the whole reason for that is what they call offense. It's to keep you as far away as possible from violating the commandment. Now, you can see where in one way that could be good, but in the other way, it could be bad, because you're heaping on, you're adding on commandments, you're adding on more statutes, you're adding on things to prevent the breaking of the original covenant, and it eventually becomes not a burden that's light, and not a yoke that's easy, which kind of defeats the purpose of what God's doing here. God wants what he commands to be easy and to be light, because what he designed to be. If you read later on, Moshe says these are not hard. They're close to you and they're in your mouth, in your heart, to do them. Well, if we're adding on more and more and more and more and more as fences trying to keep you from breaking the commandments, then that yoke does not become easy and that burden is not light anymore. And then it's not easy to follow what God says because we have surrounded it in a shell of man-made extensions uh, and guards and traditions and everything else like that God did not explicitly command in the Torah. Now, I'm not saying that tradition is bad, and I'm not saying that a little bit of, maybe offense here or there is bad also. But when that becomes, like an onion, where like you have the commandment in the center, and then you have all these different layers upon layers upon layers of commandments and statutes and things added onto that to fence off the original commandment, it's not. It does not make that yoke easy, and that burden is not light anymore. Okay, so then he goes on to say, remember Yom Shabbat, or the day of Shabbat, the Sabbath, to keep it holy. It is holy. The Sabbath is holy, and we are to keep it separated and sanctified and consecrated by keeping it separate from the rest of the work week, and to not behave on that day like you would the rest of the work week. God says you are to work 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Shabbat to Adonai your God. In it you shall not do any work, not you, nor your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your cattle, not even the animals, nor the outsiders within your gates, not even the outsider within your gates. None of you are to do anything. It is a complete day of rest for everybody. For in 6 days Adonai made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested, or it should read, and ceased on the seventh day. God doesn't need to rest. He doesn't get tired. But he ceased on the seventh day. So he made enough. He created enough. It was time to cease. It was done. Okay? We worked enough those 6 days. We worked enough. It is time to cease and be done for the seventh day, and to spend that day with Adonai and with our families. And so, and for us, it is a day of rest because we do get tired. So, thus Adonai blessed Yom Shabbat, or the day of the Sabbath day, and made it holy because it's a remembrance. So in that, it's implying it's a remembrance of what he did in creation, about all the things that God did then, all the good he created, all the good he's done for us since then. It's a general day to remember God, to be close to God, to fellowship with God and with our families. And that is why that seventh day is consecrated, made holy, and set aside. And we're not to do anything during that day that would detract from fellowshipping with God and fellowshipping with our family and fellowshipping with our fellow man. All right. Honor your father and your mother so that your days may be long upon the land which Adonai is giving you. So what does all that mean? So there's two things. One, if you disobeyed your father, and if you dishonored your father and mother in the Torah, and you were found to be that kind of rebellious child, you were actually stoned to death. You were put to death then. But the second thing is that your father and mother have gone through things that you have not yet. And so if you follow their advice, godly advice and wisdom, that your days will be long upon the land because you won't die prematurely because you acted in foolishness. Okay, do not murder. Okay, now some say do not kill. That's not what that says. It says do not murder. There's a difference between murder and killing. Okay, so killing has to do with causing something to die, not in an evil manner. So, for example, uh, when Israel went out to war and fought the Canaanites and the Philistines, and they killed them as soldiers. That was not murder. That was killing. Murder is when you kill somebody um, that did not deserve it. Um, uh, when it was done in a sinful manner, done with selfish motives to rob them or steal from them or get back at them. Those are all That's all murder. Killing is a totally different thing. And so I hope that clarifies that. Do not commit adultery. Okay, now, um, so with adultery, you have the physical act, right? Most people say it's a physical act, right? But it's not. Think about what Yeshua said. He said, even if you think about and lust after a woman in your heart, you've already committed adultery. So remember here, it's in all this. For example, if your father or mother, if you've already thought about disobeying your mother or thought, man, I don't want to listen to my father or mother, get on my nerves, I don't want to listen to them. If you've already thought that stuff, you've already violated the commandment. If you think about on Shabbat, man, I'll just do this and it won't really matter, or all these different things of that nature, you've already in your heart violated Shabbat. So it's not just a physical outwork. You remember that Yeshua also said that all the evil flows from the heart. Okay? So even if you don't physically act it out by speaking it or doing it or whatever, just having it in your heart and thinking on that and giving place to that in your heart, you violate the commandment. Okay? Remember that God sees the motives in the heart, and you can hide things, you can not do things, and that's great if you don't act it out. But even if you're entertaining it in your heart and mind, you still violated it. Do not steal. Okay. Well, what's our definition of stealing? That can be pretty wide if you think about it. Okay. Generally, stealing is taking something that's not yours. Um, and it can mean a wide breadth of things. If it's not yours, you don't take it. And it's not just taking money or taking things out of a store or stuff like that. It's also, for example, and this may seem kind of weird to put here, if you're using somebody else's intellectual work and you don't cite them, that's stealing. You're stealing their ideas. They did all the work for that. You're stealing it. Do not bear false witness against your neighbor. In other words, do not lie. Okay, false witness against your neighbor could be actually telling them something false that could harm them or rob them or cause them to go to prison. It's not just something where, like, I go ahead and falsely accuse them to someone. It also has to do with just flat out lying. If you're bearing false witness, you're lying. Okay, and lying, if you look in the Parashah, Shaul, it says in Shaul's letters, but it also says in Revelation that all liars will have no part in the kingdom of heaven. Do not covet, which means do not desire your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, his manservant, his maidservant, his ox, his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. In other words, and that's usually where sin begins. This last commandment is usually where sin towards your neighbor begins. Is when you start desiring something they have that you don't, and when you despise stuff what you have and are ungrateful for it. That is when sin enters in. All right. So like I talked about earlier, after the people experienced everything, they wanted Moshe to speak with God from then on out. They didn't want to hear him anymore. They said, we continue to hear from him, we're going to die. Okay. Now, Moshe tries to tell them, hey, don't be afraid. And he tries to explain to them why God appeared that way. God appeared this way to cause you to have the fear of him and for you to listen. And so there was a purpose behind it. But even hearing that doesn't seem to have allayed their fear. So Moshe returns to God. And again, I know in Devarim there is other things associated with this account of what happened, but I'm not going to delve into that till I get to Devarim. Moshe returns to God, and God gives him other instructions, such as not making idols. Obviously, he talked about that in the Ten Commandments, right? When you make an altar, it is not to be made with, not to be made of stones that are hewn with a tool. It is to be made with earth, and it is not to have stairs that go up to it to where the priest's undergarments or hit their nakedness will be appearing. That will be like cause people first of all, it's disrespectful. First, another one is going to cause people to just look up there and to think things they shouldn't, and so it's a bad idea. And so God says, don't do it. But He does promise to every place He causes names to be mentioned to be a blessing to Israel. So every place He causes name to be mentioned. So in the tabernacle, right? Because we're talking about like explicitly His name being mentioned. In other words, His name being in a set place. So in a tabernacle, it kind of moved with Israel from place to place to place, and then before the temple was created, it kind of moved around in Israel, and eventually ended up in oh, my mind's went blank. Um, End up in Shiloh. I don't know why I brain farted on that. Sorry. So it ended up in Shiloh. Okay, but before that, it moved around. So anywhere God made His name His to be mentioned, and it's usually a connotation that having to do with the tabernacle or the temple. But I mean, it could be taken further than that. And even now, wherever His name is being mentioned among His people, He is there. Okay, He will cause them to be blessed and cause Israel to be blessed. All right. And then God also, I just talked about that, warns them about being, having steps, and then the priest, going up the steps and being exposed. All right, so that is the end of Parashah 17, Yitro. I hope that you enjoyed the study, and I hope that you, again, like I say, every video that you guys will go back and read the scriptures yourself. Maybe you've already followed along with me. That's great. I do encourage you that you start trying to examine some of this in the original Hebrew. I know some of you are like, well, I don't know Hebrew. I don't even have a clue. There are, excuse me, there are software programs out there that you can hover over the different words in the Hebrew text, and it will tell you what they mean, and you can kind of say that way. There are dictionaries out there where you can look at the Hebrew words and kind of look at the history of them. So there are ways, even if you don't know Hebrew at all or even very well, where you can still go ahead and do a study and learn a little more depth or see a little more depth into what you're reading. So please, I encourage you to do that. In either event, please read the scriptures for yourself so that God may speak to you and show you things that maybe I missed. All right. So as always, prayer requests, if you have them, please go ahead and send them to that email address right there on the screen. And I'll be more than happy to pray for you or anyone you want me to pray for. I only need first names, and I don't need every kind of nuance of what's going on with the issue. Just kind of give me the gist so I can pray. That way we kind of try to keep personally identifiable information out of your requests for your safety and for mine. So yeah, please go ahead and send them. I'll be more than happy to pray for you or those who need prayer for. So that is it for this week. Laila Tov and Brachot to you. I will see you next time.